In 2023, the Ukrainian army went on a much vaunted and much publicized offensive operation with the intent to drive Russia back to the sea, to split the Russian forces, and to set up a bridgehead from which they could launch future operations to completely eradicate their territory and go back to the 1991 borders eventually. That was the plan last year from Ukraine and from the Western allies. Didn't quite work out that way. In fact, they basically broke their teeth on the front of it. And ever since that time, Russia has changed from the defense to the offense. And especially over the last few months with the taking of Avdiivka and then now the territory further around that, almost all along the 600-mile line of contact, the Russian army is on the advance. You may recall that in the beginning of this war, everybody liked to say, especially in the West, how bad the Russians were. Well, we're going to take a look today, and I'm so excited about this episode. I've really been looking forward to it for a long time because we have, in my view, the best analyst anywhere on major networks, on his own show, Alex from History Legends. We've had him before. He's going to help us break some of this down and show you some things you probably didn't know. Alex, welcome back to the show.
Welcome to the headquarters, everyone. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, buddy, man. Always glad to have you in the headquarters here, or maybe glad to be in your headquarters, however it works out. But, listen, I want to talk about that first because it was, quote, common knowledge that the Russians were awful, that they sucked at the beginning. You had the Washington Post saying with headlines kind of like this one right here, that Russia's military is incompetent, and that makes it more dangerous. Or this one here from I think this one was Forbes, complete stupidity and incompetence. So we just added another one, and of course Zelensky himself has to add his 2 cents in there that that Zelensky called the Russian military incompetent, capable of simply driving their people to slaughter. These were all from 2022, I believe it was. And that was accepted really at face value. But as it's turned out, Alex, it wasn't quite that way.
It was exactly that way. That's why Ukraine managed to get back the 1991 borders. Obviously, that didn't happen. So the problem is that the journalists tried to blame the Russian army for a lot of the problems when the initial invasion was not meant for real invasion. The mistakes is on the Russian side. They had flawed intelligence, flawed expectations of the combativity of the Ukrainian side. But to call the Russian army bad, that's not what happened. And Colonel McGregor said it himself that now, with years of fighting, the Russians have replaced the bad commanders, replaced them with better ones. And whenever the Russian commanders do not perform on the battlefield, they're replaced. So now we face a completely different Russian army than in 2022. The Russians, throughout 2023, the Russian army basically stayed on the sideline while Wagner was fighting. So they had time to train their troops, have full ammunition, and that's the new Russian army that Ukraine is facing.
Yeah, I think that is so important to point out. Actually, a couple of those things you just said there, that this is not the same Russian army that invaded in 2022. Mm-hmm. And I think that we all agree that, at least in my opinion, I won't speak for you, that the Russians made some big mistakes. They made some tactical mistakes because they were inexperienced in combat. And that's every army's going to have that. It certainly was true on the Ukraine side. But I think that their initial errors were on the strategic level, to where they thought that they could get away with a relatively small number of forces, less than 200,000, entering on 4 different axes. I think that they expected the presence of all these Russians, tanks and everything just rolling into the country to make the nation's leadership just collapse. And when that didn't happen, I don't think they had a fallback plan. And now there's like, oh crap, we don't have enough if they resist.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. Well explained. Now, the thing is that Ukraine is facing a complete different Russian army, and the Russian army on a tactical level have also improved a lot. So now we see the Russians make more gains, and the Ukrainians can only slow down the rate of advance of the Russian army, but they cannot stop them. And for now, we can even take off the map any possibilities for Ukraine to reconquer any ground, at least for throughout 2024. Any idea of an offensive will be for 2025 if the war continues until then.
Yeah, that's a good question. If I actually I had Ambassador Chaz Freeman on earlier today, who also told me that he's not certain that the Ukraine army will be able to continue as an effective fighting force through the end of the summer. But let me not jump ahead of myself. Originally on this show, we were going to actually have you and Doug McGregor on live to talk about
Yeah.
his schedule wouldn't permit it, but he was nice enough to actually cut a few minutes of his thoughts on this, and we're going to play that for you here, and then I'm going to get you then to delve into some of the whys and the hows the Russians have been changing, because it's just not common knowledge. In fact, hardly anybody in the West tells this, because if anything even appears to be good news for Russia, it doesn't get covered here. And
Yeah.
not only is that inaccurate, it also gives a false impression for what what's at stake here and why Ukraine is having trouble. And that's what we're going to lean on you to uncover here. So first of all, here's Doug McGregor sharing some of his thoughts. Ask you a question here on the Russian tactical performance. Now, many people said at the beginning of the war that Russia was terrible tactically. They made all these hideous decisions, but then later on, now then they're making a little progress, but they're still pretty bad. How do you see the Russian tactical performance in the beginning, and how do you see it now? Is there an advancement and a change?
No, I think there has been advancement, and there have been substantial changes. The Russians came in with certain expectations, assumptions that turned out to be false. They were prepared for something different from what happened to them. And it took until probably May or June for President Putin to come to the conclusion that there would be, at least for the present, no solution to the problem. And that's when you had other general officers that came in, and you had changes in leadership at every level. I mean, there were lieutenant colonels that were rotated out, colonels rotated out. You saw a different approach to warfare. And that approach has evolved tremendously in terms of how they fight and what they use to fight. And now I think if you were to walk into a Russian brigade headquarters, and they still fight largely as brigade groups, although they may be a little larger than what we've had in the past, and also in some cases smaller. And they have figured out that as you go through this process of fighting, that you have this long checklist of things that you absolutely must do, or you're at risk of being destroyed by your enemy. And the Ukrainians have proven to be very good soldiers. Now, they're living in the Cold War structure for the most part. They're backward tactically because of us, but they're still very good fighters.
Yeah.
And I think what the Russians learned was, well, first thing, you have to establish your dominance over the area in terms of intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance. You have to know what you're dealing with. You have to have a picture on the ground in real time of what's out there. And then you carefully place all of your strike systems to where they can actually contribute in different ways. In other words, whether it's automatic mortars, or 152 millimeter artillery, or larger, or tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, rocket artillery, whatever it is. And then, of course, the heavy use of unmanned systems, both for reconnaissance and strike. All of these things were integrated into what I would call all arms warfare. Now, the Russians used this term back in the Soviet period. They talked about all arms armies. Well, the notion of all arms has moved from the army level down to the tactical level, so that someone on the battlefield can designate a target, and the decision-making regarding what weapon to use against the target, the speed with which it has to arrive, and what it has to do when it arrives, all of those questions are being answered very quickly, to the point where cruise missiles are launched from the Black Sea within a minute or two, and they arrive on target in 4 or 5 minutes thereafter. The speed of the decision-making, the speed of the response is mind-blowing. It's very rapid. It's very decisive. Now, you know that I wrote a great deal in the past about the criticality of this, and tried to push this notion of an ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, strike and maneuver and sustainment as part of an integrated package. I think the Russians have done that. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it works. Now, the other thing is, in warfare, warfare does one of two things. It either improves the force over time or it destroys it. The Russian force survived. If the force survives, new leadership emerges, new understanding takes root, a new culture emerges. Then the force goes on to greater success. That's what's happened with the Russians. And they now have what I would call a very successful, largely professional force. Now, we in the West are very smug and arrogant, and we say, oh, well, they're terrible. You were so much better. And I say, just look at these Russians. I've heard this many times from people. The Russians do things differently from the way we and the Europeans do business. That doesn't make them incapable. It doesn't make them incompetent. Simply makes them different. The
Now, let me
Russians, the
specifically
Russians are
on that.
doing well, is what I think we should
Yeah.
conclude.
And in fact, there was an article by retired Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin recently in the Royal United Services Institute, where he basically addressed an issue that many in the West say that, oh, well, because Russia hasn't taken a lot of territory here, that proves that they're no good and they haven't learned anything at all. But he argues that they're actually fighting a different kind of war, to your point here, to where they're actually focused not on gaining large amounts of territory, but on destroying the enemy's ability to resist. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between those two?
Well, remember, during the First World War, if you look at the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians and the Austrians and the Russians, once Warsaw fell, there was an attempt and then ultimately success in gaining control of the Baltic littoral. But besides those territories, which the Germans regarded as strategically essential to them, the rest of Russia and Ukraine were largely ignored because these vast territories in and of themselves had no value. And instead, what occurred was that the Russians then dashed themselves to pieces against German defenses. They had some modest short-term success against the Austrians in the south with the Brusilov offensive, but it was ultimately rolled back in any case. It was too late in the war for the Russians to make any real headway. And I think the Russians understood that they were in a somewhat similar position, that once they gained control of most of the territory that was historically Russian, not all of it, but certainly most of it, and the Russian-speaking population, I think they decided to go over to the defense until they had a well-equipped, well-trained, well-officered army, which they now have. And it took probably longer than President Putin would have liked, but it's worked. And that defense fulfilled its mission, which was to become impregnable. Just as the German defenses in the Eastern Front were impregnable to the Russians, the Russian defenses were impregnable to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians stupidly obliged and dashed themselves to pieces to the point where they have nothing left.
And so now then, do you see Russia's, I guess their new, or maybe it's not new, but their current operational art to be able to continue to push in the west, in the east along that 600-kilometer front and possibly open up a northern one? Are they going to be able to succeed on that with their new capabilities?
Well, I think so, because the Ukrainians can no longer mount the defensive in the way they could in the past. They don't have either the works on the ground, the millions of men ordering their forces to defend everything, every inch of ground to the bitter end. Yeah. Well, that's a prescription for certain failure. We Americans have never learned this lesson, by the way. Terrain in and of itself has no value. Terrain is only valuable if it gives you an advantage on the battlefield. The Russians understand that. So if the terrain gives you an advantage, hold on to it, use it as long as it's useful. That means the enemy then confronts attrition. It can be attrited, and that's what's happened. And when the terrain has done its job and you no longer need it, you move on to something else. In other words, ground is something you drive over, walk over, fly over, but in and of itself, it has no value unless it gives you a real advantage tactically, operationally, and ultimately strategically. And that's what the Russians have done so well. They've understood that. We're the ones that are saying, well, they only took 20%, they failed. No, they took what was needed, just as the Germans did in 1914. And ultimately, remember, the Germans won the First World War in the East. The Russians collapsed. That was the lesson.
Hello, I can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. I want to ask you a couple of questions based off one of the
Yeah,
things Doug said there. One of the things he mentioned is that Russia does things differently than the West does, than NATO armies did, than we did when we went into Desert Storm, for example.
yeah.
Uh, how do you see that? Is that your assessment as well?
Yeah, I think the big difference between the Cold War is that during the Cold War, we expected the Soviet army with the Warsaw Pact to attack with hundreds of thousands of men, which is clearly not the case. Now the Russian army is much smaller, and for sure they will act differently. But I don't think that NATO armies, if they had to fight right now in Ukraine, would perform much more differently than any better than the Ukrainians or the Russians. I think this is the new style of warfare, and and on top of that, I think that the NATO would have some problems in the first months of the war if they actually intervene.
Okay, actually,
Hypothetically,
hang on. Let's camp on that for a second, because that I know that I've heard many colleagues who are otherwise pretty intelligent just dismiss any opportunity. They said, obviously Ukraine. I mean, they're brave, but if we were fighting in there, if this was a conventional war with us, of course, we just roll through Russia. But you seem to think that that would be the case even with NATO troops. Why do you believe that? Especially, this is not potentially theoretical. If you have either the Polish or the French actually bring some troops into the Western Ukraine, we could actually see something of this on the ground. What would you expect to happen in that case?
well, first of all, depends how many NATO troops, but I think the NATO troops are now not used to suffer heavy casualties at one moment. So the bloodiest day in the US Army in Afghanistan is maybe 20 soldiers. Iraq, same thing. So what I mean is that what if the US forces go in and start losing 500 KIA every day? So it's going to have an impact on the command structure and the morale of the troops. So they won't be able to continue like that. So personally, I don't think NATO will intervene directly. I don't see how it can help everything. I think it would just make things worse. And
Yeah.
as for the French, I think they have their own agenda. So perhaps they want to help Romania or Moldova, something like this, to get back Transnistria. But I don't think that there's a big plan to intervene directly. The French army is simply not ready, and I
Yeah.
don't think any of the European armies are ready either to intervene. And as for the US, I think they're more preparing for a war against China as they are for a war against Russia.
But let's I agree with everything you just said there. They're definitely not ready, and they're mentally not even prepared for that. But I think that I'm hearing you say that, let's say that it was 9 months from now, 12 months from now, and that they did make a decision for whatever reason, doesn't even matter. But if they engaged on the field right now, you say the way that the U.S. NATO side fights, they might not even have as much success as they did. And I wonder if that includes the fact that they would have air power and more engineering assets, for example, to try and penetrate those lines. Do you think that they would be successful where the Ukraine side wasn't in last summer's offensive?
Honestly, I can't say. It's very hypothetical. Depends how many troops. We do see the problem of attacking through minefields, attacking through open terrain. I don't know how NATO is prepared to face swarms of drones, artillery barrage, aviation missiles, the entire firepower. So I'm not sure how the tactics can evolve. The only thing NATO can bring is more troops. So let's say they bring 10 times more mechanized troops. Maybe they can push the Russians back, but the question is at what cost?
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's why I think your point is so poignant. They don't mentality
Yeah.
understand that the number of casualties that it would cost to take that kind of ground. And I think that there's too much disbelief in the
Yeah.
West that Russia could hold out. That if they had the better troops, that they would not be successful, especially in those layered defenses, which I don't see any evidence for. And I can also attest, Alex, from my own experience in the U.S. and the NATO allied military exercises, is that there is not a lot of comprehension on what it's like to be under that kind of
For
fire.
example, right here, we saw the artillery piece with some cage around. And although these are called cope cages, nowadays most Russian vehicles have some sort of protection layer on top of their vehicles, whether it's artillery, thank you, whether it's artillery or BMPs that are attacking. They all have this protective layer against drones. Now, it is good enough to halt a couple drones. Of course, if there's drone after drone, there might be gaps, but it's good enough to stop the small drones from inflicting damage. And the problem is that if you have a NATO column attacking, well, we saw what happens when the Bradleys attacked during the summer. You had an entire column of Bradleys, and the Western equipment showed that it's not better than any other. That's also one problem NATO has to understand, is that their equipment is not necessarily 10 times better than what the Russians have to offer, whether it's in terms of vehicles, artillery, firearms. It's just about the same. It's the most important is tactics, operational maneuver, how you use these weapons in real time. This is what's important. And let's be honest, NATO nowadays does not have real military experience.
I can attest to that as well, because we've spent so much time with counterinsurgency, whatever, over the last nearly 2 decades, and very little mentally even preparation for this. Now let me jump back into here, because I don't want to get off the topic too much here. Let's go back into, say, the summer of 2022, and we'll start from the position. I'm sure you remember, it was quite famous at the time. There was a 2-battalion attempt to cross a river by the Russians, and they did a terrible job, and they bunched up their troops, and the Ukraine side found them and whatever. And so at that time, that's when people were really saying the Russian side is incompetent. So if you could, from that time through, say, the fall, when they were driven out of Kherson city and out of the Kharkiv area, because it did look like, from a certain perspective, that Russia was getting beat there. How do you characterize what happened in that period?
Well, the situation is that if we actually look into that unit that tried to cross, it was actually Luhansk militiamen. They don't have much military trainings. They had the vehicles, but they did not have all the training. They attacked, and they reacted poorly to the attack. So it wasn't a well-planned ambush by the Ukrainians, and that commander messed up. But once again, it's not because one Russian commander messes up an attack that the entire doctrine of the Russian army is bad. For example, up until April 1945, you had American columns get annihilated, ambushed by some third-tier German territorial units. Doesn't mean that the U.S. Army was losing, or that the U.S. Army's doctrine during World War II was bad. All throughout the entire war, you had entire U.S. columns get destroyed. But it's not because one commander is either bad or unlucky that overall the situation is bad. Nowadays, we see that the Russians are learning from these mistakes, and they are improving. And just like Colonel McGregor said, that's exactly what we're seeing. The Russian army withstood the first shock, and now they're quickly improving. Now, I have to say that we can say the same thing about the Ukrainians. They also withstood the first shock, and they're also learning. However, they don't have the manpower and the industrial power to actually reach 100% of their capabilities.
Now, one of the things I noticed, and I know this is something you've covered extensively, when the operation to take Avdiivka started with the Russians, they had been just kind of inching along for quite a long time, for quite a number of months, since the Ukrainian offensive petered out in the fall of 2023. But they seem to start moving a lot quicker in the Avdiivka area. And what it looked like to me is that they were making much more effective use of combined arms operations and cooperation among the infantry, the artillery, the drones, and the missile forces and the air forces. Was that a good characterization? Have they made some advances in that area?
In my opinion, the big difference, what the Russians have noticed, is they understood that US and NATO satellites see their every moves. So whenever they plan a big offensive, NATO satellites will spot any concentration of force of the Russian army. And that's why in the first days of Avdiivka, they had troubles, because you had entire columns that were spotted miles ahead and destroyed. Now, from an operational perspective, we see that the Battle of Avdiivka I mean, Avdiivka was already extremely fortified. So that's a big part of what happened. However, one of the big things we have to understand from an operational perspective is that there's the major city of Donetsk, south of Avdiivka. From there, the Russians could hide entire battalions. They could camouflage their vehicles, they could camouflage their troops in buildings, in garages. And whenever this battalion had to move forward, all the troops go into the vehicles, and within 15 minutes, they're already at the front attacking. And this, Ukraine cannot do anything against it because the troops are concealed, and at the last moment they show up on the battlefield. So it's very hard for the Ukrainian drones, it's very hard for the artillery to respond in a timely manner. And this is exactly what we see now again and in Chasiv Yar, is that the Russians can camouflage a lot of troops in Bakhmut. That way, when they attack, within a couple minutes, we're talking about maybe 5 miles at most, they have to cross at full speed, and then they reach Ukrainian lines. That means that the forward elements of the Ukrainian army are essentially on their own for the first wave of the attack, and they don't have the support of their firepower, artillery, and drones.
And by the way, just for all our viewers, if you're not familiar with Alex, he's got this incredible channel, History Legends, and you have a new video out today on Chasiv Yar. If you want to get all the details on that one, please go look at it. It's awesome, as almost all of them are. And I wonder if there's one other thing you can address here, because I think it's related to this, the way they're operating right now. I know you also did a video not long ago on the so-called meat grinder attacks, because there's so many times in the Western press, even recently, I've still seen them say, well, the Russians are losing like 1,000 people per day because they just have these people they just throw into slaughter and meat grinder attacks that have no chance of success, but they lose a lot of people, but they have a lot of people, so they say. What is the real truth to that?
So it's a myth. It's meat grind attack or human wave attacks is a propaganda term more than a military term. Like you said, I made a video about it, but we really started talking about this during the Korean War, and after, when the NATO forces, no, not NATO, but the UN forces talked about their experience. They said they were swarmed by Chinese forces because they did not understand enemy tactics. And then again during the Vietnam War, then again during the Iran-Iraq War, it's always the one on the defensive that will say they're getting swarmed by enemy troops, although this is not what actually happened. And now it's once again the same thing that is applied to the Russians by saying their tactics are barbaric, the lots of casualties. It's just to mock the enemy. It's not really what the Russians are doing, because clearly there's not one single video of these so-called meat wave attacks. Not one of all the hundreds, of all the thousands of videos we have of all the drones always surveilling the battlefield. There's not one showing wave after wave of Russian soldiers attacking. As a matter of fact, even those soldiers in the trenches, that they all have GoPros. There's not one of them that can show footage of actual Russian human wave attacks.
That's such a good point, man.
So we have so much footage. Even the soldiers have GoPros, yet there's not a single one that shows these massed infantry attacks. We don't even see videos of massed Russian casualties. There's not one footage of an entire field covered in Russian soldiers. So I think it's all part of a propaganda campaign to diminish the capabilities of the Russian army.
Now then that the Russians are getting continuing to move west from Avdiivka through Chasiv Yar and several other places here. What do you think is going to be the Russian moves, say, through the next few months, or at least into the summer? Because there are some commentary, and I've seen interesting things in the so-called British intelligence report that comes out periodically publicly. They claim that there's a big buildup, and I think Budanov actually said a couple of days ago that they see a big Russian offensive getting ready to unleash somewhere at the latter part of this month or the first part of June. And I actually saw in one of the Russian telegrams that has proven to be accurate more than any of the others over the last couple of years, actually mocked that and saying, what are you talking about, a new one? We're doing it right now. They're not going to be another one. Do you expect some big push somewhere, or do you think that what they're doing now, they're just going to continue methodically doing?
I think they will continue what they're doing. I think this idea of big red arrow fences for now, it's not going to happen because just the fact of having minefields and drones makes it very hard for such offensives to happen. Just think about 100,000 men on the road. You can see it from 20. It's going to be 20 miles long. So I don't think this is going to happen. I just think the Russians are going to continue incremental attacks on this front. And I think if you want to understand the Russian logic in warfare, you have to look back at what the Union troops did during the U.S. Civil War. It's approximately the same theory. So continuously attack the enemy and never let him off the hook. This is exactly what the Union troops did starting 1864 up until the end of the war. The battle of attrition will favor the most numerical, the army with the numerical advantage and with the industrial power, which is the Russians compared to the Ukrainians. So the Russians went from this Avdiivka meat grinder, and the moment it ended, now they activated the Chasiv Yar meat grinder. There's also the Krasna Horivka. So they're attacking everywhere, meaning the Ukrainians have no other choice but to remain on the defensive and continuously lose the margin of maneuver that they once had. For example, during the summer, there was this threat of actually breaking through Russian lines, but now the Russians want to pin down the Ukrainian army with small offensives that the Russians can control. And like I said, if you want to know where the Russians will attack next in force, it's always next to a major urban center. They will jump from one urban center to another because this is the only way to hide large amount of troops in today's world where you have the hyper surveillance of the battlefield.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point to highlight here, that modern warfare, this war really is dramatically changing how ground combat is going to be conducted, at least for the foreseeable future. That is different, because I remember, Alex, when I was was with Doug in the 2nd ACR, and we were patrolling the East-West German border toward the end of the Cold War, and there's always the issue that the Soviets could come rolling through the Fulda Gap and all that, and it was with we had these big sweeping tank armies that could come across. We had the same things that we would move here and there. But that was before drones were a normal part. And, we relied on satellite imagery or aircraft or so. And, you had to have the airspace for that. But we could move around and actually rehearse doing that again in large movements on the ground. But now that if you do that, everyone can see, and with missiles and drones, FPV drones, or artillery, long range artillery, there's so many ways to reach beyond the front line that war can never be fought that way again.
Absolutely. And then actually even tank tactics have changed. Probably when you were there, tanks had formations of mutual firing support. However, nowadays we rarely see more than 1 or 2 tanks at most within the same vicinity, because they're just going to be bigger targets. So nowadays the battlefield has completely shifted in how you operate. So now actually we can talk about the tactics. It's all about speed. And this is what we've seen with the latest Russian attacks. So if you can show the video of the micro district, yes, so you see the Russians here, instead of going through the main road, they took around the fields and they rushed for this forested area. Now this forested area is the springboard into Chasiv Yar, and they just dashed. And then there was a second unit that came in. And as you can see, they're using these BMDs. So it's amphibious vehicles with 30 millimeter autocannons. They cannot bring a lot of troops, but they're very mobile. So there's about 5 men in each vehicle. So they have to do these rounds. So there's a first unit, they bring 50 men. Then the vehicles move back, and then you have a second unit that comes in, and they can provide suppressive fire while they disembark the troops. Exactly. Here you can see they disembark the troops. They disembark them in the forest above trenches. And that's how the Russians then bring a new batch of troops. And the Ukrainians they lose the ground and they have to pull back. So every time the Russians now have shown a greater tactical ability to maneuver across these open fields. And this is what the Ukrainians should be worried about. For example, for Krasna Horivka, do we have the footage with the tanks? Yeah. So once again, we see that they have these cages on top of the vehicles, but now this offensive is controlled. This commander is actually coordinating the entire battle live. So you have a first column advancing with the supporting fire of some tanks, and you have the infantry now being disembarked within these first set of houses. And you have this tank and another. I think they're providing direct fire support. But here, stop. This is what I thought was amazing in this footage from a tactical perspective is you see how they went around instead of going straight. I wonder why they went in that direction. But it just shows that they have learned the art of maneuvering small armored columns. Maybe they bypassed some minefield.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. Probably they had some idea. Maybe they'd sent some sappers in to find out where the mines were, and then they went around them and through them. That would make sense.
But this means they actually followed the path that was demined.
Yes.
We don't have any footage of their sappers, so they must have done this very skillfully, covertly, exactly. But also you see that they're protected by this layer, by this tree line. So this tree line is also protecting the vehicles until the last moment where they dash through the open terrain. So, and if you continue the footage a bit forward, yes, and then they all reach that area and provide suppressive fire with tanks. They all fire right at the buildings and disembark the troops. And then you have a new batch of soldiers coming in after. And this all takes maybe 5-10 minutes. It's very hard for the Ukrainians defenders to actually stop this attack. They can only counterattack. And you see the commanders, they're looking at everything in real time so they can guide the column. So I think the commanders now have much more duty than back in the days where they had NCOs that could take care of a lot of the battle. Now the top officer will control and see everything that's happening. But we see that the Russians have multiple columns advancing at the same time. We see that they know how to maneuver across fields. So this is something that the Ukrainians should worry about.
And we, you know, Alex, we had an former American military guy who went to volunteer on the Ukraine side on the show about 2 months ago, I guess. And he was saying that in some of these areas, and he wouldn't tell us exactly where he was for security purposes, but he said that all the time they were there, he said they could not get out of their trenches anywhere because there was always either something falling at them, something falling out of the sky, FPV drones. He said that they couldn't do any maneuver against that. Yeah. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your observation of, while Russia's doing this, while they are maneuvering forward, what are they doing to the defenders in trenches or in the buildings?
Suppressive fire, artillery fire, drones. But what they want to do is that before attacking some place, instead of the meat wave attacks, they will pin down the defenders, just like the soldier said, the American volunteer. You will pin them down with artillery, everything you have, so that just from a morale perspective, the moment you have armored columns coming at you, the soldiers will most likely abandon their positions. And the Ukrainians will have to launch a counterattack to regain that ground, which happens. Sometimes they do manage to counterattack. However, the problem now is that Ukraine is facing a shortage of infantrymen. And it's not your regular Mobic that can carry out these type of attacks that are extremely lethal. You see what they're doing there. This is not your average Mobic with 2 weeks of training. Your average Ukrainian soldier conscript is good at holding the ground, at pointing the rifle in one direction and at shooting at anything that comes. Defending is much easier than attacking. So for these attacks, you need trained military personnel. And this is what Ukraine lacks at the moment. Doesn't mean that in a couple months, Ukraine won't be able to attack. But as of now, Ukraine has no units capable of attacking the same way we saw here.
And Alex, when we read that Ukraine just passed this mobilization order or at least it's close to it, where they're going to try and bring 500,000 people into the fight
Yeah.
here. But then on the other side, you have what appears to be a Russian system now, not just a unit here or there, but a system where they train their people up with experience or so that when they keep bringing new people in, they start from these skills here. It's hard to see how the Ukraine side will ever match that, even to stop it, much less to counteract it.
Yeah, the Russians have a different system, and they had their first mobilization, but then they saw it's widely unpopular. So what they're doing now is trying to entice people using a very capitalistic system of big payouts. So I think as a Russian soldier gets 4 times the average salary in Russia if he signs up, and this is
Wow.
very good for the poor classes in Russia or the ones in Siberia that don't have much prospects economically speaking. And it's a bit sad because some guys believe that if they die on the battlefield, at least their family will be taken care of. But there's always this financial aspect. Now, Ukraine doesn't have much money, so they have to resort now to conscription. And money is a problem. Many soldiers have not been paid. And I think the problem of the Ukrainian army is a lack of organization. They don't really know the actual strength of every unit. Money disappears and corruption, let's be honest. That's one of the problems of the mobilization, is that not everyone gets conscripted. You have the poor classes that are overwhelmingly targeted. The wealthy ones have either already left the country. All the while there is martial law. Martial law prohibits any adult male from leaving the country. Yet we learned that 1 million male Ukrainians managed to flee abroad.
Anyway, yeah.
1 million. It's not just crossing over the border across the river. It's an entire system that allowed these people to escape, and they're not coming back.
They're definitely not coming back. And when you see that those that can't escape and that do get corralled anyway, they don't have a lot of motivation to really apply themselves. And if they're not getting the training anyway to do more than what you talked about there, to man a trench line, it's hard to see how they can ever do an active defense and do a local counterattack to undo some of these advances by the Russians.
Exactly. Now, what we do have to say is that we don't see large-scale surrenders of Ukrainian soldiers either. So that means that the Ukrainian soldier is a good soldier. He will do what he has to do, and he will sit in that trench, but he will not surrender the moment conditions are hard. Probably because conditions were already hard in Ukraine. Also, the fact that the average age of these mobilized personnel is 43. And this makes sense because this is the biggest generation in Ukraine too, the one born just before independence. So we see that the moment Ukraine became independent, there was a huge crash in births, either from people leaving the country in the 1990s or just because the economic situation was bad. But this is the situation Ukraine has to face. They need to find soldiers, but I think they need to mobilize their entire population and make them realize that it's now or never. I think for a long time, the Ukrainians tried to show as if the war was going in the right direction by always mobilizing a little bit of men. But that scared off a lot of people. I think Ukraine needs to double, triple down now if they want to have a chance in the coming months.
Yeah, but it's really hard to see how there is much of a chance, which is one of the reasons why I'm always advocating that even the West should help them out and seek a negotiated settlement, because I just don't see the fundamentals on the two sides, and that means extended off the supporters on even beyond that, left from the West or from Iran and North Korea, et cetera. I just don't see a path for Ukraine to ever reverse this situation.
You know, in that video with Doug McGregor, he talked about losing ground and accepting that it's not okay that the US forces will not fight the same way. But there's a big difference, is that the US, the last time they actually fought a war on their own ground was the US Civil War. And
Right.
no, it's true. So it's easy to give ground when it's not your land. During World War II, during the Battle of the Bulge, it was very easy for the US forces to just retreat 20, 30 miles. It's not their land. They don't care. But if it's your land, you're more attached to it. And I don't see the Union forces during the Civil War just abandon Chicago just because it makes better tactical sense. I don't see the Union forces abandon Washington just because it's going to overstretch Confederate forces. There's no way. The Union
Right.
forces fought there on the front line, and even the Confederate, they would fight for the big cities because this is your land. If you lose it, you might not get it back. So to talk about this, oh, we fight differently, it's because you're less attached to ground too. It's much easier to fight in a neutral terrain.
Well, I mean, that's certainly true. That I don't dispute that is the case. It's just unfortunate that sometimes, whether it's your ground or not, it's wise to give ground. The Russians did that in the World War II. They did a few times give a lot of ground in order to take some. But
Absolutely.
that's also like massive armies too. So it's not really apples and oranges on that case here.
You see, if I can just say something
Sure.
before I forget, you're 100% right. But back in the days, the Soviet Union, it was a dictatorship. So a dictatorship can pretty much do whatever they want. People don't even know what's happening really much. However, now when the Russians did give ground, it wasn't their land as per se. Whenever they retreated, it was Ukrainian land they abandoned. For them, it was this neutral territory they don't really care about. Even in Robotyne, they were willing to retreat because it's just Ukrainian fields. But I don't think they would have retreated that much had the Ukrainians attacked in Belgorod, for example. I don't think the Russians would have abandoned the city of Belgorod if they were in trouble, because it makes more tactical sense. So there's this attachment.
No, I'm not arguing with you that is the case here. I'm just saying from
I
a
know.
cold-hearted military perspective,
100%.
to win, you have to give up, and it's an easy call to make for somebody who's just watching from the camera like I am. But
It's
that's what's happening.
So the Russian army, they had to do some big retreats. Like Kherson, I think, was painful for the Russians, and I think that was the moment the Russian army was in big trouble from a moral perspective. And let's say the Battle of Bakhmut saved the deal for the Russian army. So I think the biggest mistake for Ukraine was then to have like when we talk about giving ground, I think the biggest mistake for Ukraine was to have accepted this battle of attrition instead of retreating. I know this goes against what I just said, but like you said, there's this subtle.
Go against what you said. There is the emotionalist aspect and the tactical aspect, and they both are at play, and you just have to deal with it.
But there's a subtleness in how much you can lose ground and how much you have to look at the military and political aspects. But in that case, I think the Ukrainians should not have waged the Battle of Bakhmut. I'm not talking about abandoning the city altogether, but they could have fought a fighting retreat, and just establish better lines.
Exactly that. Yeah,
exactly. Totally so we're on the same page. We're using different words, but
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I said, listen, in the amount of time we got left here before I let you go.
Today I have time. I have the time for you, so no worries.
Okay, cool. Given where we are right now, and the trends that you see, and especially as the Russian army continues to grow by reportedly 20, 30, 40,000 per month of people signing up. So they don't have a manpower issue where the Ukraine side is having one. Where do you see this going, say, between now and through the end of the summer?
That's the $1 million question.
I know, that's why I'm asking you, because you're the $1 million man.
Nah, you're throwing flowers, but it's hard to say because I listened to Colonel McGregor's example in the Russian front during World War I, and the situation is a bit different because the Germans were facing a two-front war and there were problems in Russia itself. So I think it's different examples, and the Germans did invade Ukraine at one point. So the Germans did try to conquer the land. But so I don't think that World War I Eastern Front is necessarily a good example. That's all I want to say. Now, as to future possibilities, like I said, we have to look at big cities. And from there, where can the Russians attack? So the Battle of Avdiivka and the current Battle of Chasiv Yar shows us that the Russians have this intent of recapturing the entire Donbass. Recapturing, depending on what word you want to take. But their goal is to conquer all of Donbass, so Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. Donetsk oblast is heavily industrialized, lots of big cities. It's going to be hard, but this is the smallest objective they have to achieve to call an end to this war. I don't see the Russians stopping before reaching these borders because there's no point. This is why they fought for. If they stop, what was it all for? This is what the Russian population will ask.
Yeah.
So if you look at a map, they're pushing to Chasiv. Now from there, then the next step is Konstantinivka, and they're probably planning operations to get to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, these big cities. So they're just pushing in this direction. It's painful, it's complicated, but we're just going to see them increment attack like this. And for the Ukrainians, well, the question is, how much ground are they willing, like we said, to give up? Now it seems they're not willing to give up any ground, and they're just going to bring more men into the trenches. So I just don't see a huge collapse of the front in Ukraine.
But you do see it continue to inch to the west.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
but at the same time, there are rumors of a Russian river crossing of the Dnieper. Once again, it's too early. I don't see this happening right now.
Yeah, I
Same
don't
thing
either.
for a Russian attack on Kharkiv. Yeah, it looks nice on a map, but from a logistics perspective, it's very complicated, and it doesn't solve the main problem of the Donbass.
It is, and plus you see how much time and how difficult it is to take Chasiv
Yeah.
Yar, which I think is about 12,000 people, and you're talking about a city of what is it, like 1 million? I think for
Yeah,
Kharkiv.
it's very
They
big.
would need hundreds of thousands more troops, and that's actually the last thing I want to ask you, because one of the comments that all of these Western leaders keep making, especially in Europe, is that, oh my God, we have got to stop them here in Ukraine, because otherwise they are coming for us. They're coming west. What do you say when you hear people talk about Russia invading Poland or the Baltics or Romania, et cetera, given how much hard time that you're saying they might not even be able to take Kharkiv?
Yeah, I mean, I think they always try, the media clearly always tries to scare people by what I find funny about the media, though, is that on one end, they mock the Russian army by saying they use meat wave attacks, how incompetent they are. They don't know how to use tactics. But at the same time, they say, watch out, they're going to invade us all. It doesn't even make sense. So that's why I don't take them seriously, because they say one thing and the opposite during the same day. So for now, the Russians, Putin has his war in Ukraine. They have some objectives. For sure, there's Russian-speaking populations in neighboring countries that are bullied, in Estonia, for example. But there's NATO. It's not this complicated. There's also some Russian speakers in Transnistria, so Moldova, and in Kazakhstan. So for sure, these are the hotspots, but.
And you know, that's one of the reasons I specifically asked you that question, to counter some of this, because you know, you say you can't see how they can see that, and obviously I'm in 100% agreement, because I say it all the time. But when these fear comments come from, like, Jens Stoltenberg, for example, who is one of the common frequent people who says this, well, he is the Secretary General for NATO, so if all the regular public who don't see your channel hear him say that, they think, well, it must be true because he said it and he wouldn't lie. That's the problem. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you that. And we're going to get this, you know, hopefully this video gets shared by a lot of folks. And listen, everybody who's watching here, if you haven't already liked and subscribed to the channel, please do, and absolutely share this with everybody you can so that they see, because this is information you just aren't getting anywhere else. And this, we need to really cut under this disinformation that all these fear-mongering people keep holding in, because what Alex is saying here is the truth.
You're too kind. You're too kind. You always invite me. He always invites me. And whenever, if there's anyone coming from my channel, subscribe to his channel. The same thing, like, subscribe, because he's really too kind with me. Every time.
You've earned this, my friend, seriously, because there are so many people who are saying things that are not substantiated by the fact and the truth on the ground. So
I mean, that's the sad part, because we do have a lot of footage. So I would understand such, let's say, talk if we don't have the videos. Like in the first months of the war, when we only had the Ukrainian videos, but we never had the Russian perspective. That's another thing I want to talk about for 1 minute.
Sure.
But in 2022, we don't actually know what the Russians went through because we only have the Ukrainian perspective of the Russian attacks. So we only saw the Ukrainians bomb certain columns, but we don't have the big picture of what the Russians were trying to do. So there's some battles where we have zero footage of the Russians actually winning, but we know they did win. For example, the river crossing operation in Izium was a military
right.
masterpiece. We have zero footage. So, and the example is nowadays, same thing in Chasiv Yar, you will see the Ukrainians boast about destroying a Russian unit, but they will not say that it's only one out of 2, 3, 4 units. They only got one out of multiple Russian units. So yeah, the problem is that all these videos are extremely biased. They want to portray that they're winning, but they're always winning a step back. So they don't show the full perspective of the Russian attack. That's why you need to actually look into what both sides are saying about that day to get the full picture.
And do you think, Alex, that this may also be another aspect of modern warfare? Because it seemed that Russia, by not putting out that video in 2022 of those kinds of things, the only narrative that was getting out in public opinion was the Ukraine side. So whatever they said is the only thing that got substantiation.
Yeah.
Do you think that was a calculated decision to try and take advantage of the media environment to try and push back on some of this?
I think the Russian army was not up to modern standards in terms of its communication campaign. So from a military perspective, perhaps they were good, but from a media perspective, they were extremely bad. So they gave it an impression that still people talk about today that in 2022, they were extremely bad, which I disagree. They were not that bad. They did actual good campaigns. It's just that we don't have footage to see the other side of the narrative. So the Ukrainians were extremely good in the media campaign. Even now, they're extremely good to the extent that some people think there's thousands of Russians dying every day. By the way, talking about this, when you look at the chart of Russian losses, it's a straight line. That means they input 1,000 casualties manually every day. It's not actual reports. It's a constant 1,000 casualties. Whereas if you go on the Media Zona website, financed by the BBC, that actually looks into Russian social media to see the losses, there's ups and downs. And there's logical ups when there's big battles in the war, and then it falls back. This is something accurate, or at least closer to the truth.
Yeah, it's closer to the story. Yeah, who knows what
Same thing for the Ukraine. It's not like always losing men. Sometimes there's less. But the simple fact of saying the Russians are losing every day 1,000, I feel the Ukrainian propaganda is backfiring. And there's so much misinformation that a lot of people now just don't trust them anymore. Even when they say the truth now.
I know that's the problem. You just don't know what's right and what's not.
Yeah.
We did have you also had a video of something on Robotina, if I'm and I don't know that we've shown that one. Is there anything?
We can take a look at it now. But it's about the Russian tactics. So essentially, from what I remember when I talked about it, the Russians actually dashed across 5 kilometers. And once again, we see them maneuver across fields. We see them provide fire support, and then they bring the troops wherever they want them. But it's coordinated. You see, this is drone footage. So the drone operator is guiding the soldiers on the ground. So if there's a tank, or let's say a Ukrainian tank is hidden somewhere, the Russian column will avoid it. Well, in theory, right? So it just goes to show that the Russians are not tactically inept, and that they do with the terrain. How do you want to move otherwise in this sort of environment? There's no cover. All the buildings are destroyed. You're talking about NATO troops. I don't see how NATO forces would do differently than what the Russians are doing now. I don't see how they would do differently, especially since they're not used to having huge casualties. And this is why also it's funny when you see Ukraine send all its soldiers to be trained in the UK, in Poland, Germany. They're getting trained by instructors that don't know really what warfare is. And it's not a problem in itself. It's just they don't know, they don't have the direct feedback for their soldiers. So that we saw this in the summer when you have Ukrainian tank crews so they were trained tank crews from Soviet era tanks, but now they had to relearn their skills for German tanks.
Yeah.
And
Right.
they asked the Germans, "Ah, how? But it's all nice, but how do you go across minefields?" And the Germans said, "You just go around it." What?
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 Yeah. I remember reading some of those, and it was in the Washington Post, or at least one of
Yeah.
them. They talked about what had happened there, and I was shocked because especially we trained on that kind of thing when I was with McGregor in the Second Armored Cav Regiment, and I know how those kind of things are very complicated to do, but you don't get to go around them if it's set up correctly. You have to breach the things, and for the fact that we allegedly taught them that, didn't teach them how to do an effective breach, I just couldn't believe it.
And last thing, we know for the summer offensive, it was planned by NATO personnel, or at least to an extent. They did war games. And the war games were highly successful. So I'm just thinking of the parameters they used, they chose. No, really, we know it's U.S. and British military commanders that drew the plan for the summer, yet it didn't work. So, and then they blamed everything on the Ukrainians, of course. But
Yeah.
just to say that it's not NATO, it's Ukrainians. They don't know how to apply it. But it's just to say that warfare in real, it's extremely complicated. The moment you come into contact, all your plans and ideals, they disappear. And most European soldiers have not. I don't think any NATO soldier has ever been under artillery shelling, for example.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I actually pointed that out earlier.
Yeah.
During our Desert Storm fight, the Battle of 7-3 Easting, we were under sporadic artillery fire, and I remember a few, and I nearly got blown up in Afghanistan by a single rocket once. It was, I don't know,
Wow.
it wasn't very far away. It didn't injure me, but that was one. And I've often thought, I don't even know what it would be like to be under these barrages like these people every day and continue to operate. That's just something that nobody on our side has any idea about.
Yeah, how do you attack enemy positions under enemy fire? Like, imagine you have an infantry platoon, a company that have to attack a trench, but then you have artillery fire left and right. Do you expect the soldiers to just run in danger? No, they'll stay pinned down, and the attack is stopped. And this is exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine. So the tactics is very complicated. It's it's very hard to
War is
push
hard.
forward. Yeah,
real war is hard.
it's hard because people die, and people don't want to die. So if they have the choice between staying hidden and pinned down and moving forward, they'll stay hidden.
That's exactly what the guy that we had, Matt Van Dyke, actually was. That's exactly what he said, and all of them did that exact same thing.
Well, it's interesting,
Not
but
surprised.
so for the Ukrainians during the summer, because the vehicles would get targeted, they would resort to infantry attacks, small groups trying to infiltrate positions, but it didn't bring that many results. It just increased casualties. So attacking is hard. And this is what we see often in warfare, is that defending is much easier. So you don't need trained military personnel to defend the buildings, but to get them out in the open, that's extremely hard. So
it's a very different skill set that's needed.
I mean, we shifted away from the main topic, but
oh, it's great. Yeah. And I think people, everything this is, all the stuff we've been talking about is highly educational and informative, and stuff that just the West doesn't want to cover, because if you say anything that makes the Russians look good, it doesn't get covered. No one wants to talk about it. They only want to talk about the things that the Ukraine side does. And there's plenty of things that they do that are praiseworthy. But there's two sides, and if you want the truth, you got to look at both of them, and that's one of the reasons we asked you to come on.
And I'm very happy about your reporting. Your videos are also amazing with all the guests you bring in, I think. And it's also well organized, your show. So you have the videos, and you have the the image is moving. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah,
Anytime,
a
anytime.
lot of that's Gary Villapiano, our executive producer. He brings a lot. He used to work for Fox for a lot of years, so
Oh, okay.
we're very grateful to have his skills on this show as well. But listen, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been a great show, and I'm sure we're going to want to have you back on here very soon. And again, everybody, go visit History Legends. This kind of stuff, he does this all the time, except his are a lot more entertaining than mine are.
No,
You have
no,
more
no,
humor
don't
and
say
some other stuff in there that is very unique. I've never seen anybody else do the combination that you do. So it's informative and fun to watch.
Perfect. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks. And thank you for joining us today. We are actually going to have a show that we thought we were going to have this morning. Had some technical difficulties with Ian Proud, a British diplomat, a misfit in Moscow. He's going to be telling us some of the things that were going on behind the scenes that we just didn't know about. It's a fascinating new book that he's published, and he's going to be on with us this afternoon to tell us all about that. You won't want to miss it. I believe it's 3:30 p.m. Eastern time today. Thanks, and we will see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.